And our next presenter is Steve Englehardt. He is a PhD student at Princeton, and he actually presented last year on his Open WPM tool. I think the chairwoman mentioned it this morning in her remarks. And he's going to tell us some of the measurements he's made with it.
Thank you, Kristen. Happy to be back this year. So I'm Stephen Englehardt. This is joint work with Dylan Reisman, who's also in the audience, and you may remember him from this morning, and Arvin Ryan, and both at Princeton University and the Center for Information Technology Policy. So I want to share with you some insights from our most recent measurement of online tracking on the top 1 million sites. And as I'm sure many people here are familiar with, the web is very interconnected, right? When you visit a website, when you load resources from that website, you're not just connecting to that server, but you end up connecting to a bunch of different third-party servers. In particular here, when you visit CNN and the New York Times, you end up connecting to 84 different third parties. And any third party shared between those sites would have the ability to track you in some way. So we wanted to better understand this ecosystem, and we built a tool to do so. It's called OpenWPM. You can check it out at the link here on the bottom of the slide on GitHub. And I presented on this last year, so I'm not going to focus too much on it this time, but I'll just say it's a web crawler that uses a real browser, and we go and visit sites and collect anything we think might be useful for understanding what kind of tracking is happening on those sites. So we use that tool to run the Princeton Web Census, which is a monthly million-site crawl. And there we collect things like JavaScript calls, all the JavaScript files that are loaded on the site, to look at things like fingerprinting, as well as requests, responses, and browser storage like cookies, to see how our fake users, our bots, are being tracked when we visit different sites. And so the paper has a ton of awesome results. I encourage you to read it. Again, there's a link here at the bottom of the slide to check it out. I won't have time to go through all of the results. Here's a highlight of some of the ones I won't be touching on today, in particular showing that many, many third parties are involved in cookie syncing, and also that the protection tools like Ghostery or AdBlock Plus do pretty well, but they end up missing things like less popular third parties or less popular tracking techniques. And we go into a lot of detail in the paper on that. But instead, I want to focus on a couple insights that I think are most relevant to the audience here today. And the first is the consolidation of top trackers. So if you go to the top million homepages and you bin the third-party requests by the organizations that own those domains, you end up with a graph that looks like this. So as you can see, there's a heavy consolidation on this end of the graph, right? There's only a couple companies that have a large presence, and in particular, Google has a very large presence, much larger than the other third parties. They're present on 85% of sites that we visited. And I think the takeaways here are that enforcement efforts can focus on these larger players and help set tracking norms. So if Facebook started to do fingerprinting, and just for those of you who may not be familiar, fingerprinting is the notion of identifying a user's device by the device properties instead of, say, setting a cookie on the device and using that to track the user. So whereas you can clear cookies, you can't really clear your fingerprint because you can't change your device's properties on demand. So let's say Facebook started to use fingerprinting. You can imagine many other trackers in the long tail might feel it's okay to use it. So focusing enforcement on those top parties can help influence the rest. Also, that large trackers can quickly deploy techniques to a very large number of sites. We found a couple new techniques during our measurement, and we were surprised to see them on like 6% of sites, but that's really because it was just one third party who decided to implement this tracking technique, and now all of a sudden it's on many sites. Most likely, most users would hit one of them. And then also acquisitions can quickly shift tracking capability, or say could combine data sets that may not have been combined before it. And in particular here, Oracle would be an example of this, right? They purchased BlueKai, they purchased Add This, and now both of those tracking data sets you can imagine being combined. The second point I want to make is that trackers can impede HTTPS adoption. So the HTTPS is basically a secure connection to a server, right? If you want to make sure you're connecting to that server and you want to make sure that the data you're getting back hasn't been tampered with, you'll do it securely through HTTPS. And if that server happens to load resources from a non-secure server, it's called mixed content. So basically, some of the content on the page isn't secure. And if that happens, some browsers like Firefox will show a warning, a downgrade to the security indicator, that, in my opinion, looks worse than just a normal HTTP page, which wouldn't have any kind of yellow warning on it. So sites which may not normally want to adopt HTTPS because they're not handling credit card data, they're not handling login data, may actually avoid adopting it, so they don't get errors on their page if they happen to have mixed content, or if, for example, a third party happens to include mixed content. And of the sites that we found this mixed content on, half of them were caused by third parties, 10% by trackers. And it's important to note that some of these parties actually did everything right, some of the sites, right? They included only secure sub-resources, and then one third-party cookie synced or basically redirected to a non-secure resource, meaning the whole page then had a security warning just because the actions of one specific, one of those 84 third parties, as I showed in the first slide. And we also found that half of all third parties are HTTP only, so there's a lot of efforts needed to move the ecosystem to HTTPS everywhere. And so the takeaways here is, again, that tracking may have second-order privacy impacts, and that may end up doing things like slowing the adoption of encryption, or for non-encrypted connections, actually leaking identifiers in the clear to the network, and, for example, could aid in network surveillance efforts. And the last thing I want to discuss is the use of new browser features for fingerprinting. And so what we found here was all of these techniques that I show on the slide are being used to fingerprint users. And in particular, Canvas is being used more often than these others, but all of them have some use. And I think what I want to highlight here is any new browser feature that comes out, I expect it to be analyzed and potentially used for fingerprinting. If it will help someone identify that device, you can bet that someone will implement some technique to fingerprint users with it, and we can expect them to be used in that way. And I want to focus on the fact, though, that we're seeing browsers respond to this. So a year before we did our study, there was a paper called The Leaking Battery, which actually looked at the use of the battery API for fingerprinting. And then we went and measured the use of that in the wild, and we found that sites were actually doing it, or scripts were actually doing it. And in response to both of those papers, both Firefox and Safari ended up removing the battery API from the browsers. Firefox unshipped it, and Safari just never shipped it. And I think the point here is that browsers are starting to view fingerprinting as abuse, right? They attempt to mitigate it during standardization, and now we're also seeing the removal of APIs that are being used for fingerprinting. And so that's kind of I think from a privacy perspective, that is a positive thing in the ecosystem. And we've also found that early detection of the use of these techniques can help stem adoption. So, back when we first measured canvas fingerprinting, it was being used on the top 5% of the top sites. And then after we released that study, we saw it drop significantly, although in the absence of measurement, we've seen it kind of coming back, and there are more details in the paper on that. And so our data is available if you're interested in checking it out. The data used in this study, the million site measurement, as well as a bunch of kind of targeted measurements for different things, like let's go run a crawl with AdBlock Plus enabled and see what tracking looks like. All of that is available on the website, again, at the bottom of this slide, and you'll see some links in later slides. But if you're someone who maybe isn't very technical, not used to writing SQL queries, getting some information out of that data might be pretty difficult. And this is an example of just the code that it takes to get third-party responses from our data. So let's say you want to know, what are the third parties on the New York Times? You'd have to write kind of this equivalent of this SQL query and data. But we don't want you to have to do that. Instead, we want you to be able to download some library. We're calling it census.py. That might change. But we want you to be able to make queries like, give me all the third-party requests for this domain. And then you can just pass in a pointer to our database, pass in the site you're interested in learning more about, and get back a bunch of rich results on that. And we're hoping to do, we're hoping to have a pretty thorough API, in particular looking at cookie syncing, tracking, and so on. But we encourage you to reach out to us. We kind of have an alpha analysis server set up. We're interested in giving people access to it. We're interested in seeing what people want to get from our data and playing around with the library. So we encourage you to reach out to us. You can see my contact info here. to send me an email and we can give you access to that data. So thank you very much. Looking forward to the panel.